In the pre-colonial world of the Igbo people, art was not entertainment, it was reverence, ritual, and reality itself. Among their most profound expressions was ULI, a fluid, symbolic visual language drawn on the skin of women and the mud walls of sacred spaces. But these weren't idle decorations. ULI was sacred. Each mark carried spiritual meaning, every curve, dot, and line told a story, asked for blessing, or served as a form of divine communication. It was a living script, visible not on scrolls but on the human body and the walls of shrines. It connected the physical and spiritual worlds, wrapping the skin in protection, beauty, and sacredness. ULI was traditionally made using a black dye extracted from the ULI plant, also known as Ficus platyphila. Once the dye was prepared, women, especially those initiated into certain spiritual or social ranks, would create flowing linear motifs, often mimicking natural elements, vines, rivers, stars, and animals. The art form prioritized impermanence. ULI designs would fade after a few days or weeks, symbolizing life cycles and the spiritual philosophy that everything is transient, yet deeply connected. This fading aspect made each act of ULI creation a temporary shrine, living today, gone tomorrow, remembered forever. Beyond the body, ULI was often painted onto mud walls of sacred spaces, temples dedicated to the earth goddess Ola, the river deity Idemalai, or ancestral shrines. These wall paintings weren't just art, they were guardians. They sealed the walls with sacred intent, inviting divine presence into the home, and warding off spiritual impurities. In many villages, these walls became storytelling canvases where memory, myth, and mysticism lived together in intricate harmony. ULI designs were the Igbo people's version of divine scripture, silent yet potent, vanishing yet eternal. Most notably, ULI was inseparable from community rituals. During festivals, women would paint each other before dances, fertility rites, and naming ceremonies. The act of painting was intimate and spiritual, both a beautification and a bonding. A woman covered in ULI wasn't just adorned, she was transformed into a sacred vessel. In these moments, the body ceased to be flesh, it became a sacred scroll, a temple for expression, a gateway between worlds. ULI turned the everyday body into divine architecture. As we begin this journey into the world of ULI, remember this, you are not merely looking at designs. You are reading a forgotten language. You are walking through a temple built from skin and earth. And you are about to witness how the art of the ancestors still pulses quietly beneath the surface of Nigeria's ancient soul. In the ancient Igbo world, ULI was not just practiced by anyone, it was mastered by a sacred circle of women who served as artists, priestesses, spiritual engineers, and cultural warriors. These women were more than creatives, they were living vessels of ancestral wisdom, chosen to carry and transmit divine messages through their ink-stained fingers. In a society where spirituality was woven into every thread of life, these women were revered not just for their artistic skill, but for their ability to channel the unseen world onto the human body and sacred walls. When they drew ULI, they were not painting, they were invoking. These women were often the Omiu, female chiefs, priestesses of Ola, or highly respected mothers who had gone through specific rites of passage. They held deep knowledge of ULI symbolism, cosmology, and ritual application. Their hands became sacred tools, and their creations were not random. Every line they drew reflected a prayer, a warning, a remembrance, or a prophecy. ULI was a form of visual divination, a spiritual literacy passed down from mother to daughter in hushed tones, sacred gatherings, and during moments of spiritual crisis or celebration. The power of ULI artists lay not just in their technique, but in their intuition. They didn't sketch with rulers or measure angles, they flowed, guided by ancestral whispers and inner vision. Their brushes were often sticks, feathers, or even their fingers. With each movement, they channeled something older than themselves, the voice of Allah, the wisdom of Enenimi or mother spirits, the gaze of the ancestors. The symbols weren't just beautiful, they were powerful. They could bless a newborn, prepare a bride for marriage, or purify a woman returning from childbirth. During community festivals like the IIG, New Yam Festival, or the Ofola, these women emerged in full glory. They would paint themselves and others in intricate uli, turning the village square into a sacred theater of divine bodies. Women shimmered with spiritual geometry, each curve glowing under the sun, their bodies transformed into walking temples. Drums echoed, chants soared, and the people danced, not just for joy, but in cosmic alignment with ancestors and gods. The Uli women didn't just make art, they summoned sacred energy into the communal bloodstream. But their role went deeper. In a world before written scripts, these women were the scribes of the spirit, archiving philosophy, nature, and cosmology without ever writing a word. Every pattern, whether on a wall or on skin, carried encoded knowledge about gender, land, morality, and balance. Truly, these women shaped consciousness itself. They reminded their people that beauty was not vanity, it was virtue, divinity, and resistance. In their hands, the body became a shrine, and in their art, the ancestors lived. To the untrained eye, Uli designs may look like random lines and abstract doodles. But to the initiated, each curve, dot, and spiral was a spiritual code, embedded with ancestral meaning, natural philosophy, and divine presence. Uli wasn't just art, it was metaphysics drawn in black ink. The patterns were visual incantations, mapping the Igbo universe on the canvas of the body and earth. And in every line, there was an echo of the eternal. The Igbo worldview is deeply spiritual and cyclical. Time is not linear, it spirals like the sacred Igbo symbol. Life, death, and rebirth are not separate, they are stages of the same cosmic dance. Uli expressed this reality with symbols like the spiral, which represented reincarnation, evolution, and ancestral return. The zigzag lines symbolized lightning, divine movement, and sudden change, echoing Sango's thunder or idealized serpent power. Dots and concentric circles mirrored the womb, the sun, and the collective soul of the clan. These were not decorations. They were sacred blueprints of the universe. What makes Uli even more profound is how it merged the natural with the supernatural. A pattern inspired by a creeping vine was not just botanical, it was also a metaphor for the way life interconnects, wraps, and grows. The ayaya, net-like design, might evoke a fishing net, but spiritually it meant catching dreams, channeling destiny, or entangling evil. Animals like lizards, turtles, and birds were drawn not for realism, but for their symbolic power, representing agility, wisdom, or freedom of spirit. Every Uli symbol operated on multiple planes: physical, emotional, ancestral, and divine. This visual language was also gendered and sacred. Many symbols centered on feminine energy, wombs, breasts, rivers, and moon cycles, because women were seen as the first temples, the original creators. The earth goddess Ola, whose body nourishes all life, was the source of inspiration for many designs. Her presence is evoked in fertility patterns, protective lines drawn during menstruation or childbirth, and sacred spirals traced before planting season. Uli was, in many ways, Ola's alphabet, written not on paper, but on skin and sacred soil. Most haunting of all is that these symbols were never meant to last. Like sand mandalas or ash drawings in other cultures, Uli was made to fade, and in fading, it mirrored the very essence of life. That temporary nature made each piece sacred, urgent, and meaningful. You could not preserve it. You could only experience it. Uli forced you to be present, to see the divine in the now, to understand that art, like life, is beautiful precisely because it disappears. This was not just an aesthetic, it was a philosophy. And it's why every ULI pattern was a sermon of the soul. In ancient Igbo cosmology, art was never separate from spirit, and ULI was the direct visual invocation of the gods. These weren't just artistic expressions for pleasure or status, they were coded prayers, sacred contracts, and cosmic signals. Every time a woman dipped her fingers into ULI dye and painted symbols across her skin or a shrine wall, she wasn't just decorating, she was opening portals. ULI was the bridge between the visible and the invisible. Through it, the Igbo reached their Alusi, deities, honored their Ndaiki, ancestors, and activated the power of the divine realm. Among the most invoked deities through ULI was Ola, the Earth Mother, and the moral compass of Igbo society. Her presence was central to every ULI ritual. The sinuous curves mimicked the fertility of her body, and the symmetrical balance of designs reflected her laws of order, balance, and justice. Shrines dedicated to Ola were adorned with ULI motifs that called her spirit into the earth, blessing the soil, the wombs, and the cycles of nature. When women painted themselves for harvest ceremonies or fertility rites, they were becoming living extensions of Ola herself, fertile ground for spirit and sustenance. ULI also spoke to deities like Idemelai, the goddess of the river and keeper of the sacred python. Patterns resembling water currents or serpent coils were drawn in her honor. These were not mere symbols, they were summonings, asking for protection, purification, and wealth. During periods of drought, women would paint ULI in serpentine shapes and perform ritual dances at riverbanks, hoping to stir the spirit of Idemelai from her aquatic palace. In that moment, ULI wasn't just art, it was ritual technology, the inked Wi-Fi between humanity and the gods. The divine role of ULI extended into death and ancestral reverence. When elders passed away, their burial walls or ritual spaces could be painted with ULI to help guide the spirit into the land of the ancestors. Certain patterns signified peace, protection, or spiritual elevation, ensuring that the deceased entered the next realm without disturbance. In essence, ULI functioned as a sacred escort, inscribing the final blessings before one crossed into the eternal village. And when the community gathered, the sight of these symbols reminded the living of the constant conversation between the dead, the gods, and those still walking the earth. Perhaps most powerfully, ULI empowered ordinary people, especially women, to participate in divine life without the need for priesthood or sacrifice. With just a calabash of dye, a brush, and a knowledge of sacred symbols, one could speak to the gods, protect a household, or consecrate a field. ULI democratized holiness. It proved that the divine could be touched, worn, and lived. Every line was a line to spirit. Every pattern, a portal. And every woman who bore it became not just beautiful, but blessed and bound to the sacred. For centuries, ULI flourished, etched on skin, whispered through symbols, and glowing across mud temples in sacred symmetry. But then came the missionaries. The colonial conquest of Igboland was not just a political invasion, it was a spiritual erasure, a war against ancestral memory. British missionaries and colonial officials did not understand ULI, and worse, they feared it. What they saw as primitive doodles were in fact visual scriptures of a people's relationship with their gods, ancestors, land, and identity. So, they labeled ULI a product of idolatry, hedonism, and witchcraft, and then tried to silence it. Churches were erected where shrines once stood, and Igbo women were told their sacred symbols were marks of shame. Schools imposed Western aesthetics, rejecting ULI as backward. Young girls were discouraged, even punished, for practicing the art of their grandmothers. In some villages, Christian converts went so far as to destroy ULI-painted walls and mock the women who bore the sacred ink. What was once holy became taboo, and generations of cultural memory were swept aside in the name of civilization. ULI artists were stripped not only of their art but of their spiritual roles and communal honor. This assault wasn't just on lines and symbols, it was on feminine power. Remember, ULI was primarily held and transmitted by women. It celebrated the body, the womb, the earth goddess, the cycles of birth and harvest. Colonial Christianity imposed a morality that demonized the body and painted African women's sacred roles as sinful. The very curves and symbols that once invoked Allah were now condemned as pagan filth. It was not just cultural, it was theological warfare, weaponized against indigenous beauty, wisdom, and autonomy. By the mid-20th century, ULI was fading fast. The walls of Allah's shrines cracked and crumbled, untouched by sacred dye. The last generation of ULI artists grew old, holding on to their knowledge in silence, afraid to pass it unless they be accused of witchcraft. The once vibrant villages where every festival sparkled with ULI now echoed with forgotten patterns and unspoken grief. Many designs were lost. Entire visual languages evaporated. The sacred tattoos of the gods had been buried under Bibles, bullets, and colonial blueprints. And yet, even in silence, ULI survived. In dreams. In memories. In the few grandmothers who still painted during moonlight. In the hidden corners of mud huts where symbols had not been washed away. Like the ink itself, which fades but leaves a shadow, ULI refused to die completely. It waited, quietly, for a time when its lines could rise again. And when they did, they would not just return as art, but as a resistance, a rebirth, and a reclamation of ancestral power. Just when the sacred lines of ULI seemed buried under the weight of colonization, silence, and shame, they began to re-emerge, glowing faintly in the hands of a new generation. The 1970s in Nigeria sparked a cultural renaissance, and at the center of this artistic rebellion stood one name, Uche Okeke. A visionary painter and scholar from Saka, Okeke didn't just admire ULI, he resurrected it. He called it a natural synthesis, the way of merging traditional African aesthetics with modern expression. In Okeke's brush, ULI became resistance art, a weapon against cultural amnesia. Together with other artists like Obiora Udechukwu, Chike Aniaka, and Ede Udechukwu, the Nsukka Art School ignited what became known as the Nsukka movement. They studied ULI not as relics, but as living blueprints, reworking its motifs into paintings, textiles, murals, and even performance art. These artists didn't just copy old patterns, they infused them with modern urgency. Political commentary, gender identity, memory, and trauma. In their hands, ULI spoke to colonial scars, military rule, and global black struggle. The sacred ink of their ancestors was now dripping on modern canvases, telling new truths. This revival wasn't confined to the ivory towers of art schools. Across southeastern Nigeria, young women began reclaiming ULI as body art, tattoo inspiration, and spiritual expression. Festivals revived ancient symbols. Artisans painted modern shrines, fashion designers stitched ULI into fabrics, and digital artists launched NFTs inspired by Igbo spiritual geometry. What was once forbidden began to bloom again, not as nostalgia, but as cultural rebellion and ancestral pride. ULI became a coded language for the modern African who refused to forget. What made this rebirth even more powerful was its symbolism, women taking back sacred authority. The same symbols that once declared a girl's transition into womanhood were now used to reclaim narratives stolen by colonial scripts. Feminist scholars and artists embraced ULI as a symbol of resistance to Western patriarchy, celebrating its focus on feminine cycles, fertility, and power. In reclaiming ULI, they weren't just reviving designs, they were restoring the divine feminine, recentering the earth goddess Allah in a world that had once pushed her into silence. Today, ULI stands at a crossroads, ancient and modern, mystical and political, forgotten and reborn. It is no longer just art, it is a movement, a spiritual uprising dressed in curves and sacred ink. Every time a young artist draws a spiral, every time a bride paints ULI on her hands for marriage, every time a mural explodes with ancestral patterns, it is a declaration: we remember. We resist. We return. And in that act, the gods smile once more. In an era obsessed with likes, filters, and fleeting trends, something ancient is making a quiet but thunderous return. ULI, the sacred ink of the Igbo ancestors, is reawakening as both a spiritual force and a cultural revolution. Across Nigeria and the diaspora, a new generation is picking up where their forefathers left off, not in mimicry, but in reclamation. ULI is no longer just a forgotten tradition, it's a living, breathing act of resistance, revival, and radical self-expression. It is the soul of Igbo identity drawn boldly across time. Walk through a gallery in Lagos or scroll through African digital art on Instagram, and you'll see it, swirling ULI patterns boldly layered onto Afrofuturist bodies, adorning melanin-rich skin, interwoven with poetry and protest. In universities, students study ULI not just as art history but as an archive of African knowledge systems. In remote villages, aged priestesses smile as their grandchildren trace those once forbidden lines on their arms, echoing lost lullabies and ancient prayers. The lines are back, but this time, they are sharper, louder, and deeply intentional. For Igbo youth searching for meaning in a fractured world, ULI is more than just heritage, it's healing. In every curved line, they see their mothers. In every dot, their ancestors whisper. In the patterns, they find clarity, connection, and purpose. ULI has become a cultural compass, guiding a generation back to who they were before conquest, before confusion. It reminds them that beauty and spirituality are not foreign imports, but native gifts, born in the soil of Ola and inked into their bloodline. Global creators are now embracing ULI as a Pan-African symbol of unity and identity. Musicians wear ULI-inspired outfits on stage. Tattoo artists in Paris and New York ink ULI spirals as a tribute to ancestral roots. Yoga practitioners incorporate ULI into sacred geometry sequences. Even brands, cautiously, are beginning to highlight ULI patterns in fashion, but the real pulse is in the grassroots, the artists, the women, the believers, the bold, who reclaim each symbol as a declaration that Africa's sacred stories are far from over. So what is ULI today? It is ancestral fire rekindled. It is feminine power revived. It is art with a heartbeat, spirit in pigment, resistance in curves. It is a living archive that breathes through those who dare to remember. Every time a brush meets skin, every time a spiral is painted on a wall, every time a child asks, what does that symbol mean? ULI answers. And its answer is clear, we are not lost. We are returning, line by line, ink by ink, God by God. ULI is more than ancient body art, it is a living legacy of the Igbo spirit, a visual language through which generations spoke to the gods, celebrated the art, and honored the divine feminine. Its rebirth today is not just an artistic revival but a powerful act of cultural healing and remembrance. In every stroke lies a story, in every curve a connection to ancestry, and in every fading design a reminder that beauty, like spirit, never truly dies. ULI teaches us that our past is not lost, it is waiting to be seen, honored, and carried forward. Let this sacred ink inspire us to reclaim our roots, cherish indigenous knowledge, and pass the torch of culture to the next generation. If this journey into the mystical world of ULI moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. Subscribe to Deep in History for more untold stories and powerful truths from Africa's hidden past. The ancestors are watching, will you answer their call?